it's fascinating to me how easily someone in one religion can find the fallacies and biases in another religion.
I think that what's fascinating,
you're razor sharp on your criticism of Islam here.
Yeah, but what I find fascinating, Jeff, is that you recognize that with other religions, but you don't do it with your own. Because
that may be the case. I'm just saying, and there's that confirmation bias coming up again.
This is Apologetics Live. To answer your questions, your host from Striving for Eternity Ministries, Andrew Rappaport.
Well, we are live, Apologetics Live, here to answer your most challenging questions that you have about God and the Bible. I am Andrew Rappaport, your host, the Executive Director of Striving for Eternity, and that this is a ministry of Striving for Eternity. And here at Apologetics Live, we do apologetics, we train apologetics, and I argue that I can answer any question that you have about God and the Bible. If you doubt that, you just go to apologeticslive.com, scroll down to a duck icon, join and participate there, and then you can ask me a really, really tough question, and I'll go, I don't know. Because I don't know is a perfectly good answer. Just remember that. So we have tonight, I think, a special guest. We'll see if he thinks he's a special guest. This is someone who has come in two previous times on the show, and always like when there's 15 minutes left in the show, he comes in, asks great questions. We get a great dialogue. We end up going long. So I said, why don't you just come in and let's give a show that we could devote to a dialogue? And he said, sure, I'll do that. So let me introduce, and I'm gonna have him correct me if I say his name is wrong, his last name, but Landon Pontius, I think is how it's pronounced. We'll see. He's going to correct me, but I only knew him of coming in on the shows in the past, having some questions, and I think both times, based on the questions, I actually assumed he was a Christian. And then we discovered, no, maybe not, because I don't have the best memory, and I didn't remember. It had been a long time between the two times he came in. And so I had to look him up and do a little bit. So this is what I've looked up and about him. So Landon is a former Christian who deconverted from a deeply embedded evangelical upbringing. His father and mother served as full-time missionaries. He was raised in a ministry campus in rural East Texas, attended Christian school, afterwards moved to Orlando, became a church leader and church musician. We'll see, he'll correct me if I'm wrong. I think he was leading the worship team. He had written an article that I just found, looking his name up, which was nice, but it was his public deconversion essay, and it's called Why I'm Not a Christian Anymore. It's on Medium, back in October 2019. For some of you that may not know, that's BC, before COVID. Some of you remember those days when things were normal. One of the things that I learned when he was on the show is that his deconversion, as it's called, wasn't driven by some trauma. Usually, I've always said that when I get someone who is against the gospel, they've had some trauma, some event that had happened in their past that drove them away. Landon didn't have that we know of from his testimony in his article and in what he came on the last two times he was on the show. He had a podcast that he co-hosted called the Meaning of the Middle podcast. And so what we end up seeing is that I think, as I put in the description, let me just actually read some of what I put in the description of Landon, because this was my view of him. I said he grew up in a missionary home in the early East Texas. He played music in church, attended every summer camp, became a worship leader in Orlando, and fully invested himself in the Christian faith that he loved. He walked away. Landon Pontius is the kind of deconvert most apologists are not used to engaging. He's articulate, kind, he's not bitter, And he openly stated here on this show previous times that he would almost prefer to believe in Christianity, but he wasn't convinced by it. And so I found both times he was on a very engaging discussion. It wasn't, as I think you're going to see, not someone who is, we're not going to have a battle, I don't think. I think it'll be a good exchange of ideas. And so one of the things I always do when I have someone on the show who is of an opposite view of my own, for the audience to know, is that I will here, because this is my show, allow my guests to explain what they believe. And I think that some people think that sometimes that that's wrong to do, because then you're letting him, evangelize, if you want to say, my audience. The reality is if Landon says something that I'm like, I want to address, I could do it a whole show on addressing that, right? But the purpose of this, and this is good in apologetics, is to get to know the person you're speaking to, get to know what they believe, so you're not dealing with straw man arguments. If you want to argue about something that they don't hold to, you're talking past each other. You may feel emboldened in that way because, oh, look, I can demolish him. Well, you could claim it that way, but the reality is that you have to be able to make the points that connect with the person you're actually speaking to. So let me bring Landon in. Landon, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks. Good to be here. Nice to see you.
Anything I say that was wrong there?
Last name is pronounced Pontius.
Pontius, okay.
It's a famously, all through high school and all, even as an adult, it's often butchered. So spelled the same as Pontius Pilate, but not pronounced Pontius because of that, but happens to be a different pronunciation. So
who wants to be Pontius?
Yeah, who knows how far back the association goes? Yeah,
and I will say, we did joke just before we went live. We did a quick test, and there was a slight delay because I see him speaking, and then I hear it. So I joked and said, if I cut you off, it's not because I meant to. And he goes, yeah, likely excuse.
He's given himself an out, so everyone just keep an eye on him.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to be able to. I had read the your essay that you had. Found that it's the neat thing of the internet. I actually said to you, I said, okay, are you the guy that did this podcast?
Yeah,
I don't know how
the best. Yeah.
I didn't know how common the name was. And you were like, yeah. I'm like, okay, then maybe this article's from you. So I sent
Not
him.
a common name. I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay, let me ask this. Did you ever call into James White's program?
I don't think so.
Okay, because there was someone that when I did a search, that came up. So,
interesting.
So I was like, but that person sounded like a believer. So I was like, I didn't know if maybe you called when you were younger and then you deconverted. I was like, I don't know. It could be the same person.
Seems unlikely, but who knows?
So let's first talk, if we can, just so folks can get a little bit of the background of you. You explain your upbringing, I kind of gave a thumbnail, but as much as you want of your upbringing and what brought you to your what may call deconversion.
Yeah, sure. I'll try not to retread too much of what you said. I think you gave a pretty good summary. I was going to college, living in Orlando, and was involved in church, like you said, quite happily. And I just kind of started, I think, a natural process of sort of digging into my faith and asking different questions. And part of it was maybe just the age I was, moving away from home and still surrounded by Christians, but maybe found some like diversity in beliefs that I hadn't been exposed to as much in Texas. And it wasn't like I wasn't having a crisis of faith, when it started. It wasn't like any major foundational questions. It was just like questions about the afterlife and, how does prayer really work in the real world? And just some of these kind of typical questions about different things. And for the most part, it was sort of a normal, what I thought was kind of a normal, just maturing process. I'm just digging in, finding a kind of diverse landscape of opinions and commentaries and testing my views and evolving and becoming more open-handed on some things and more decisive on others. And for a while, that process felt more or less healthy for my faith. And then I think, to make a long story short, eventually I think I had sort of retrospectively realized I was chipping away a lot of pieces and holding a lot of things pretty open-handedly and lightly, to the point that I got to a certain point where it's like, I don't really know how many of these pieces are really holding together anymore. And eventually kind of came to that, I guess, not resolution, but that conclusion that, at least at the time, I wasn't a Christian anymore. So yeah, kind of like you said, maybe an unusual story. I was someone, again, like you said, that had a pretty purely positive experience. Don't have like regrets about the way I grew up and the experiences I had. And but kind of find myself where I am anyway. And I've tried to engage different ideas. I think since I deconverted, there were a lot of philosophy questions, a lot of questions about metaphysics and questions about ethics and different things that, I had to sort of replace the answers that I had grown up with and that I had had for a long time. And that podcast, Meaning in the Middle, I did with a good friend of mine, Ryan, who's a pastor in Orlando and still one of my best friends. And that was just a great way to sort of explore some of those ideas in a close relationship. And so I've been pretty intentional about digging into philosophy, exploring ideas. I mean, it's something I like kind of as a hobby, and so something I think a lot about. Like you said, I wrote an essay. I do like to try to kind of write about some of these things. And so, that's where I am now. You and I have spoken, like you said, a few times on the show, and was always really fascinated by the presuppositional approach. I live in Asheville, North Carolina now, and I have another close friend here who's also a pastor. I keep finding I'm collecting pastors everywhere I go. And
we're trying to tell you something.
Yeah. He's a Presbyterian pastor, and he introduced me to TAG, to the Transcendental Argument, and to presuppositionalism in general, and Van Til, and that whole lineage. And that was a area of apologetics that I hadn't really had exposure to, and has been a fun kind of challenge and interest to dig into and try to kind of understand that approach. I know it's something that you and I have sort of brushed up against a couple times, and something that I said I'd love to chat a little bit more about. A little bit about me. That's plenty, I'm sure.
All right. Well, first off, Jesse says, hey, Landon, or hi, Landon. So you got some folks saying hi. Let me see, which ones did I miss here? So there were some questions I had I should put this one up, because Andrew from Down Under says, oh, yes, I became a member here. I had forgotten about that. So, yeah, you can become a member on YouTube if you want. There's some way to click on that and do that. Wesley, I think, is making fun of me here. He says, everyone's a special guest.
You say he says that to everyone, huh? Wow.
I must have said it when he came in. And
it was such a nice intro, and now I just realized. Scam.
Okay. Tara is saying, no, it's debating. So that actually does become an interesting thing I'll touch on. What is a debate? Right? Because, so if we think about it, what people think about as debating is what they see online nowadays on social media, where people just yell at each other. Like, when they talk about a presidential debate, it is not actually a debate. It's just two people usually not listening to one another, just giving their talking points. It's kind of like two monologues where they just say, okay, your monologue, because even when they ask a question, usually the person never answers the question that the other person asks or is asked of them. They just go on to say whatever they want to say. But a debate is in one sense where two people are disagreeing and giving argumentation. And arguments are not bad. We make arguments all the time, but we think of arguing as a bad thing. Now that we can have a disagreement, as we're going to do today, in an informal way. It's an informal debate. That's different than formal debates. And we've had those on this show as well, where it's timed, there's rules. I wish that presidential debates and political debates would be done that way. I personally think it would be better to get like a Lincoln Douglas debate where they get up there for 3 hours and ask each other questions rather than, some media folks just going, well, we think these will be easy questions for the guy we like, and this will be hard for the guy we don't, right? So that's what, when we think of a debate, it's like, well, what is the debate? And I think what we have to recognize is a debate can be formal or informal. This is going to be an informal one. Just because we do disagree, I think we both acknowledge that. We'll both bring out our own arguments for our own side. So in that sense, yeah, it would be. So Jesse is asking the question of you. This is the one I was looking for. And he says, I'm wondering if he ever truly understands the gospel. So that's a good question to ask you. As you grew up, what was your understanding of the Christian gospel?
I think I took what would be a somewhat standard evangelical view, that Jesus died for our sins and that it's through belief in him and relationship with God that we are able to overcome the wages of sin and the fallen nature of the world and hopefully gain eternal life out of it. Probably nothing too controversial in my upbringing, though you can find a Christian to disagree with any piece of theology. I think this is a question I get often. It's a bit of that no true Scotsman thing that seems to come around, where it's everyone has their own criteria. All I can say is that as far as I could tell, as far as I knew for my entire life, basically, I was having the same experiences and beliefs that the people around me were. And I can't speak to to everyone else and what maybe his view is, but I think it seemed, from at least my perspective, to be very genuine.
So the one thing with the no true Scotsman fallacy, for folks who don't know what that is, right? Because we always try to educate here.
Sure.
The way I actually got the name was I think it was haggis or something, but there was someone in Scotland said, no Scotsman would eat haggis or wouldn't eat haggis, something like that. And someone goes, well, there's Harry over there. He's eating haggis. Well, no true Scotsman would eat haggis. And so it got the name, but it's the idea of saying that if you don't hold to something, you're not truly, air quotes, of that element, whatever that is. So in this case, a Scotsman. However, if there's a definition of what a Scotsman is, right? If you're a Scotsman, if you're born in Scotland, you're a Scotsman if you have citizenship in Scotland, then in that case, that would be a definition. And so that can be used to define what a true Scotsman is. In Scotland, if you own land, you're a noble. So technically, I own a small piece of land in Scotland, and I'm a noble in Scotland. That doesn't make me a Scottish. I'm not a true Scotsman, but in Scottish, I'm a true noble. So, when we're in this case, if I was to say, well, if you don't believe in baptism by immersion, you're not a true Christian.
Right.
That's not the definition of what Christianity is. But we would see that Christianity, the definition of a Christian is one who, puts their faith in Christ, right? And like an ultimate faith. I would say their ultimate faith is in God and His Word. And I think you'd agree, we talked about this in the past, but I think you'd agree that your ultimate authority wasn't in God's Word ultimately, because if it was, you wouldn't have reasoned your way out of it, right?
Sure, it maybe was, and then until it wasn't. I think I said this in the past too. It's not particularly interesting to me to adjudicate my sort of previous faith, because I think the point of this is that I'm not a Christian anymore, and we can sort of talk about those things. I think, I don't have any strong feelings on what people think about what I did or didn't think back then,
And it is hard, you have experiences, everyone does, and that's really what a lot of times we base things off of, right?
Sure.
But experience isn't always the best judge of truth, because, well, in college I saw a guy do mushrooms, and what he was experiencing definitely wasn't true, as he saw pink elephants coming out of the wall. Mm. And he wanted to convince me I should see it too. Yeah, dude, whatever. When you sober up, I'm going to have a lot of fun making fun of you. But so experience isn't always the best element to look for truth. But you said you specifically want to talk about the tag argument and presuppositionalism. And so the transcendental, is what TAG stands for. It's a Transcendental Argument for God. Now, for folks that may not know the history, TAG, and we're just going to say it because it's a lot shorter.
Yep.
TAG was actually, as I understand it, was an argument that was developed by a Muslim. And so I don't typically use that argument because it's an argument just for a God in general, not specifically the Christian God, but it could. I mean, it points to God. That the idea of it points to God being there. So, why don't you, if you don't mind, explain, because you're the one that wanted this topic. So, explain your understanding of the tag argument, and then why you think it's a good or bad argument.
Sure. So my understanding of tag, and so I guess we can sort of lump that together maybe with some presuppositional apologetics, though maybe we could say tag is a specific argument or style of argument within a presuppositional sort of theology or view. Presuppositionalism and tag differentiates itself from evidential apologetics, which typically has to do with what is the evidence, right? Like looking at talking about cosmology, or talking about intelligent design, or any of those kind of look in the world. We're debating science. We're talking about these different things. Presuppositional apologetics wants to go all the way back sort of to what's called the preconditions for intelligibility, and say, before we even get to a reasoned argument, how do we justify the foundation that we're standing on? How do we, if you follow your causal chain all the way back, sort of how do you justify knowledge? How do you justify moral authority? How do you justify the laws of logic? And the claim essentially is that God, I've heard it typically argued for the Christian God personally, but the assertion is only the Christian God, or only God, at least in the broad sense, can satisfy the criteria that those questions sort of demand, and that other worldviews outside of that, atheism, naturalism being one of them, ultimately collapses in on itself, or it can't justify its own foundations for epistemology and metaphysics and these things. I don't know if that aligns with your your view or understanding of it, but I'd like to know if that generally fits.
Generally, for when we look at presuppositionalism, yeah, I mean, the idea is, and the reason I say, like, I don't like the tag argument is it's not pointing to the God of the Bible, it's just pointing to a being. And so, but my argument, I have two presuppositions. God exists, he has spoken, right? Those are two things you can't prove, because if it's an ultimate, like an axiom, you have to accept it without proof, but yet you wouldn't be able to come to any other conclusion without it being true. So the example I would use in the Bible, actually in my reading today, Psalm 14, it starts off by saying, the fool says in his heart there is no God. Well, how does that work out? I think what it is that you and I both have an ability to reason, but where did that ability come from? If the ability to reason requires God, right, then that is the proof, that is a proof of God's existence, right? Because you can't make sense of anything without an ability to reason. So you have to get to the question of, well, how do you have that ability, right? It's got to come from, well, reason is not a material thing. It's an immaterial thing. That leaves my view. You may disagree. It's universal. Everyone has an ability to reason at different levels. You may reason better than I do, but we both have that ability. It's also something that, with tag, they would talk about, intangibles, right? And so it's something we can't kind of touch and feel, but yet it's there. So it needs a source that's from that. Like, it couldn't just come from chemical reactions, would be the argument. And so that being the case, then the argument would say, well, for us to reason that God doesn't exist, it first requires God. So I would say that the foolishness is using our God-given reasoning to deny the God that gave us an ability to reason. That's why it would be foolish.
Mm-hmm. So there's this idea in more sort of formal versions of tag. Mm-hmm. There's this idea of the impossibility of the contrary, which is that a Christian that's running the tag argument, part of the claim is that they have confidence that God is the answer, that he exists, because the contrary is impossible, because these other views that do not ultimately rest on the foundation of God are not internally coherent, that whether or not you agree that they're true or plausible, that they don't even have internal coherence sort of on their own terms. Like what you were saying, I might rely on reason or on the laws of logic or something and seemingly not have a way to justify their existence, and that would be considered an internal contradiction. Do you hold a strong position like that, or what is your general? So if you're taking, if we're not just talking hypothetically about tag and talking about you, Andrew, what is your presuppositional apologetic? What is your sort of claim or challenge to non-Christian views?
Yeah, I would say I would hold to a strong presuppositional view, meaning that our starting point has to be God exists, or else we can't make sense of anything else. The ability to reason is just one thing. But we use the laws of logic. We have morality. We have truth. We have knowledge. All of these things are required for us to have this discussion on whether God exists or not. So what is the source of those things? Right? Descartes is well known because I know I wanted to explain this because you are someone who, if I read what you wrote in your paper and our dialogues, you seek the truth much like Descartes by asking questions. Would that be fair?
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. And Descartes' whole thing was it is kind of funny because a lot of people don't understand when you actually look at the history of his statement that, I am that, oh shoot, I just said it before and I forgot it now.
I think therefore I am.
I think therefore I am. I hate this getting old stuff, People don't understand. People will often use I think therefore I am as an argument against God. And yet if you actually read Descartes, or at least the translation, the thing is that he was actually very inquisitive. He felt that, like you, if he asks a question and then gets an answer and asks a question and keeps going back, he would eventually get to the answer whether God exists or not. And where many people will argue he was saying God doesn't exist, he actually argued the opposite. His argument of I am, or I think, therefore I am, his argument, as he explained, was the fact that he thinks proved, like he kept going back and back and back and back, and he eventually got to the point of saying, I think, but I can't think without existing. So his argument was the fact that he thinks proves his existence, which then proves God. So it was something where it actually ends up supporting the sort of a presuppositional argument that he had very early on, before people were arguing that way. I mean, that's why I think the tag argument caught on because, and I forget the Muslim's name who came up with it, but it was long before, Van Til, who you mentioned, and folks, anyone that wants to read Van Til, God bless you. You really, I mean, no, I'm not, I'm just being serious. I mean, Van Til, you have to have a good understanding of philosophy to read Van Til. I think that's why a lot of people like Bonson, because Bonson really simplified Van Til's work. And so there's plenty of other things now. If you really want to get some good stuff on, if you want to get some good stuff on presuppositionalism, you could read stuff from Jason Lyle. Very good. Makes the arguments very easy to understand. So that'd be one. But I'm going long, and I asked, and this is supposed to be you explaining your view. So, but does that help explain my view a bit?
Yeah, I think so. I just want to make sure, like you said before, that we're not arguing against hypotheticals of the other person's view or stereotypes. So just knowing, if your position is that it's impossible, like it's logically impossible for other worldviews to be coherent and account for those things. Something along that line of a sort of strong, what we're looking for, the criteria is logical possibility, which is that it does not have an internal contradiction, more or less. Just wanted to know if that was,
Yeah, well, I would say...
I guess, so maybe, sorry, just to tighten that a little bit. What I want to understand is the criteria that would, in theory or in principle, satisfy the challenge of tag. So if you say, it's Christianity the only one that can, meet this burden of the preconditions of intelligibility, sort of what do I have to do or demonstrate to potentially refute that?
Yeah. And so just to tighten up what I was saying, I guess a bit, the thing is I'm saying that you could deny God and try to come up with a way of explaining our ability to reason and truth, knowledge, these things, but you wouldn't be doing it from a a logically founded way, because you step into absurdity when you're denying the very source of where things come from. So if I was to say, I'm trying to think of something. I'm thinking specifically of the way we're speaking right now, right? If I was to say there are no sound waves, but those sound waves are required for you to hear my voice, it's absurd. And so that would be the thing that I would say. I just want to throw this up here. Jesse, I appreciate it. I forgot when I was thinking of different people. So Jesse says, read Bonson, Jason Lyle, or watch Cy Ten Bruggencate. So I should have.
I'm not a Bruggencate fan, but
well, someone that I is a personal friend. So just for the record, and his
that's not a judgment on him as a person.
No. He is, his style, just his personality. He's kind of just terse, and so it comes off as rude sometimes, I think. And he's really a nice guy, but when he's, having an argument, even in a good way, he's short and quick, and it just comes off, I think, different than, because I've seen, but I understand what you're kind of saying, but he does break down the argument in an easy to understand way, and so I always laugh when people will say that I'm copying Cy, and I'm like, you do realize I've been teaching Presup longer than Cy believed in it. He was an evidentialist for a long time, so it was like, but yeah, I mean, I started with Presup in 1991 or 92. So is when I started understanding it and arguing, and then by 94 teaching it. So, and I think Cy started believing it in 2000s. So, just for the record, because I've been accused. It's funny. If you get someone that's known for something, right? Everyone thinks that person copied them. I'm like, yeah, no. I learned it from my professor in seminary who did his PhD in presuppositional apologetics. So,
I believe you.
So let's see. There was a question that came in, and I wanted to, if I could find it. I star them, and then I got to go find them. Okay, here. So Jesse was asking this question. This does get a little bit to the pre-sub view. Jesse's asking, what is Landon's ultimate authority to determine what's absolutely true or false, good or evil? And the reason I think this is good to highlight is this is sort of the argument of presuppositionalism, right? What's your ultimate authority, which is where we were talking earlier, right? If you think about it, I know I didn't start, but someone in the chat had mentioned it, is the passage in 1 John 2:19 where it says they went out from among us because they were never of us. They went out to expose they were not of us, right? So if you claimed you're a Christian, you walked away from the faith according to the Bible, at least, and I understand may want to disagree with it, but according to the Bible, it says people walk out because they were never a Christian. They thought they were, but they never were, right? And really what that comes down to is ultimate authority. So in your view, and I'm going to ask this a twofold.
Sure.
When you thought you were a Christian, what did you think was your ultimate authority? And then now today, what would you say is your ultimate authority?
Do you mind if I just jump to the second one?
Oh, sure. If you want to, yeah.
I just think we're going to get stuck in the mud on the questions that don't ultimately apply really to us right now. So, ultimate authority in relation to truth, is that the question?
It was true. I guess truth.
Sort of said true and good, evil, so sort of a morality, truth question.
Yeah.
I think I would sort of shift that a little bit and say it's tricky because, like everything in philosophy, the devil's in the definitions. It sort of depends what's sort of loaded in ultimate authority. I tend to ask, what's the best explanation for something? And thinking about authority in a topic like truth is kind of tricky, because I think it sort of depends what you mean by truth. I know it sounds pedantic to always just say, well, it depends what you mean by blank. But I hold a view of truth truth is not like a thing that just exists in the world. It's a status of beliefs and propositions, and the authority on whether those beliefs or propositions are true is whether or not they align to reality. I can make a claim about what's on top of this table that I'm sitting in front of, and depending on what I claim and what is actually here, that statement will be true or won't be true. And so when it comes to that question of authority, I think sometimes, and I don't want to put words in Jesse's mouth, but I think sometimes that authority question sort of smuggles in the theism view, which is like, it sort of asserts there is supposed to be something that counts as quote unquote authority. I guess I'll just say that it's not me. I'm not the one deciding what is or isn't on the table in front of me. I think it's more about this fittedness between the world outside of ourselves and how well our claims or beliefs align with that, which I think would be a correspondence view of truth.
So how, in your understanding, how would we understand what reality is? I mean, I gave the example earlier of someone in college I knew that he truly believed, and even the next day when I talked to him, he truly believed there were pink elephants coming out of the wall and going to chase him. You have people, I mean, I've been in New York City enough times. There's people in New York that are just, they believe wacky things. I mean,
sure.
I've had people tell me that they're Jesus Christ. I always find that there's someone great, I had one person who claimed he was Julius Caesar. Okay, why do you think that? Me being me, I jokingly said, "Can I see your back? I want to see if you got the stab marks." But, right? No one's. I'm a garbage man, They always are someone great, right? But you have people that have delusions, and in their mind, they think something that's not actual reality.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'd say that it's less about what's the foolproof equation, and that sort of understanding reality is more of an ongoing process of iteration, I guess, which is like even what you're saying, start with recognizing fallibility, right? We have plenty of biases and blind spots and limitations, and then we have these tools of reason and ways to try to circumvent those biases and blind spots, and ways to test these perceptions we have, whether they're pink elephants or whatever, with other people. Are other people seeing the pink elephants? Does pink elephants coming out of walls align with the other things that we believe we know about reality? I think it ends up sort of being this more ongoing process, kind of triangulating what's justified and what isn't. And I think I would hold a fallibilist view, which for the non-philosophy nerds is essentially the view that that's the best we can do, that there are things that are really absolutely true, but whether or not we can in any given moment know for 100% certainty whether or not they are is sort of a different question, and that generally we're dealing in degrees of probability and confidence, and that very rarely, maybe, to call back to Descartes, maybe there are very few circumstances where something like my own existence is like the one thing I can't be wrong about. So yeah, I know there's a lot of things mixed up in in that question, but yeah, I think so. Maybe to put a little structure or color onto my view, I'm a naturalist, broadly speaking, and I have a handful of, I don't know if you'd call them presuppositions or not, but pillars of the view, which is that, I take this to be, at least based on what I know and what I understand we know, the best explanation for life as we know it is that nature exists necessarily, that things exist with relational ontology, which I think you and I have talked about in the past at some point. Nature is innately consistent and uniform, which is that things exist coherently by necessity, and that nature is multidimensional. So multidimensional in that case is, I'm a naturalist, but I am not a sort of reductive physicalist. So those general sort of challenges about logic being immaterial or moral truth being immaterial, how do you account for that? I would say the natural world includes material things, immaterial things. It includes time. It includes consciousness. It includes things we may call universals. And that, so I have a sort of rich dimensional view of what the natural world comprises. And I think with that sort of general backdrop, logic, morality, knowledge, these things can be made sense of. Whether or not I'm right, I can't say for certain, but as far as I can tell, it at least is coherent or possible logically.
Yeah, and so
I know that's a lot of things to say, but you can just pick one if you want.
Yeah. Well, I want to pick up on coherence, because here's the thing with coherence is everyone will make they'll make a way to make their argument coherent. Now, you're familiar with the Bible, I think, enough to get this, but I remember I got together with this guy contacted the ministry, knowing he heard that I'm from a Jewish background, and he lived in New Jersey and wanted to get together, and he was going to try and convert me back to Judaism. And his argument was that only the rabbis have the answers to the difficult questions of the Bible. And I said, okay, what would be something that only the rabbis have an answer to? Right. So this is what he gave me. And I'm just going to tell you the thinking that he has. I think even with your background, you're going to see the problems. But but he said, well, see, you have David, who is, they say David's a man after God's own heart. And so the argument is that David couldn't have sinned. This is actually what Muslims believe as well. Right? So as a man after God's own heart, he couldn't have sinned. And you say, well, how did he then have an adulterous relationship with Bathsheba? And he said, well, the rabbis have the answer. The fact they argue that before going to war, you would have men give a written a letter of divorce to their wife, so that if they don't return, they can go and remarry, because the wife doesn't have means of providing for herself without a husband. And so it was a way of saying, if I don't come home after the battle, you can go get married. But what Uriah did was give a permanent writ of divorce. And that's why when he was asked to come back, that when David had the affair with her, the reason that he asked for Uriah to come back was so that Uriah would not sleep with his wife, because he couldn't, because he divorced her. And he was proving to everybody that he was divorced. And that's why David did that. So you asked the question as I did. So then why did David have him killed? Oh, because he called David Lord, and that's blasphemy. Except, like, Lord doesn't just mean God. Hey, right? It's like, so, I mean, you're already, I mean, you're giggling, and you see all the problems in this, right? But in his mind, that was coherent. and it was something only the rabbis could come and can have an answer to. And I explained to him, I said, well, yeah, of course the rabbis are the only ones with the answer because they created the problem, right? They started with the presupposition that David couldn't have sinned when David admits to sinning. He even has Nathan tell him he sinned on that very incident with Bathsheba. Mm-hmm. He acknowledges it and writes a psalm about it, and calling it sin. The easier answer is to say David sinned, right? So
Sure.
In Jason Lyle's book, The Ultimate Proof of Creation, he talks about life-saving devices, and that's what the coherence is. Every group, and you could charge me with the same thing, right? You could charge me and say, well, you're doing the same thing, Andrew. You're trying to come up with a life-saving device for your system. That could be valid. And so the question is it truly a life-saving device, or is it truly true? I don't mean to reiterate the word, but so when we look at it, we get back. This is where I come back, and this is why I'm presuppositional. We have to come back to these things that we're arguing, right? That we're making a case for, thinking for if you're going to go with Descartes, right? Our ability to think, to reason, to have truth, knowledge. These things are immaterial, absolute, and universal. And so if there is no God, if we're just chemical reactions, then we have to explain how these immaterial things come about by chemical reactions.
Well, God not existing doesn't mean it's just chemical reactions.
I was starting there.
Sure.
Right. Because we had this discussion. You don't hold to that. Well, better yet, I'll let you answer where I was going to go second. Why don't you explain to folks what your view is? Because we had this dialogue last time, right? And you hold to a different view that I was going to go to next. So,
which part of my view do you want me to talk about?
Where we could get these immaterial things without God.
So it might be helpful to pick an immaterial thing. So maybe you say like laws of logic or something. Yeah,
that's exactly the one I was going to go with.
So this is a difference partly in ontology, which is sort of the nature of being, trying to keep the non-philosophy nerds with us.
You're doing that, and I usually doing that for folks, but
you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it, right?
That's right.
So my view, and this isn't to dodge, I just want to be clear, I'm not dodging that question, but sometimes it's something like the laws of logic gets reified, which means it gets treated like an object. And so the question is sort of like, how is that object held and sustained when there are other views? And my ontological view would be that, kind of like I said, nature exists, things exist coherently by necessity, right? We can't imagine things that are contradictory that exist. We can't, we've never experienced things that are contradictory, right? It seems that the nature of existence is coherent in that logical sense. And in my view, the laws of logic are simply descriptions of that state of affairs. So it's not, so you could say the laws of logic are universal in the sense that they apply universally to existence because everything exists coherently in that logical sense. But it's not a normative force on nature, meaning it's not something you can hypothetically say, well, if we didn't have the laws of logic, what's holding the laws of logic there? What's forcing the laws of logic to make all of nature and all of reality behave coherently? That's not what my view is. My view is that it's part of the innate nature of what it means to exist is to have this logical coherence. And so when we refer to the laws of logic, the laws themselves, the descriptions are just us describing that reality, if that makes sense.
But that reality is true not because we perceive them, but because they're true, right?
Sure. But if you took all of the humans away, or all of the living creatures, however far you want to go, out of the universe, there would be no laws of logic. But the state of affairs that the laws of logic currently describe when the humans are here would be the same. So it wouldn't change reality. It wouldn't change the universe. It wouldn't change the sun and the planets and any of that stuff. That description wouldn't be there anymore. And so when you're talking about what makes the laws of logic universal and absolute, and there's a little bit of like nuance there, I guess I would say that I account for the laws of logic, but in a somewhat different way.
Yeah, and I'm going to take a tangent for the audience for a moment, because, folks, this is the thing I want you to notice, because what Landon is saying here is different than most people who deny God. I would say 90% of the people that I would talk to about laws of logic would say the laws of logic are the product of the human mind, which then they get into a dilemma because we all agree there was a time before humans, right? Some think billions of years, I think thousands of years, but we all accept that there was a time before human beings were on the earth. And so for most people that deny God, I just say, okay, so before there were human beings, could the universe have existed and not existed in the same way at the same time? And they have a dilemma, because if they say yes, they're accepting contradictions, which is illogical. And if they say no, they just prove that it's not from a human mind, right? So I say that to say this is why we take time on this show when we have someone like Landon in to explain their own views. When you're doing apologetics, you're talking to someone, yes, it is more time consuming to understand what someone says and understand it well enough you can reiterate it so that you're not taking them out of context or misconstruing what they're saying just because you got a really good argument for someone else over there, when that's not what Landon's position would be. And so I want to strongly encourage you guys, when you do apologetics, take the time, because when you come upon someone like Landon, who is very thoughtful, very articulate, and doesn't just say things off the top of his head, at least not that I've experienced. When you have someone like this, if I was to just tell him, well, no, you believe that's a product of human mind, he would laugh at me and go, you don't know what you're talking about, right? So you have to actually engage with the person you're talking to with what they actually hold to, which takes more time, takes more effort, but is essential when you're doing apologetics, right? I can't use the argument I would use with 90% of the other deniers of God than I can with Landon, because he doesn't believe that. So he's just going to reject if I tried to use that argument, he'd reject it, right? Wouldn't you?
I would, yes.
So thank you for letting me do some teaching time, right?
Yeah, of course. Did that explanation, one, make sense? And two, I'd be interested to know if you think it, the other parts of my view, notwithstanding, at least in that isolated case, does that accounting of logic at least sort of hold?
Yeah, I think you're right. It comes down to what is logic, right? What actually is it? Is it something we perceive? It's something that's there, but we perceive it. But where I have the trouble with the coherence of it is this, and this gets right back to what we were saying with the ability to reason. Why are the laws of logic true, right? Because if you study quantum physics, this actually is being challenged. The second law of logic is the law of non-contradiction that you brought up, right? You can't have A and not A in the same place in the same time, right? So I can say I have $20 in my wallet, and then you open my wallet and you don't see $20. Well, it was there earlier, right? Well, that's the same time. Or I can say I got $20 in my wallet, and you open my wallet and you find $20 in Monopoly money. Well, that's not the same way.
Well, I think the logical contradiction would actually be not whether or not what you said is true, but if you claim that it's true and not true. That's the impossible scenario, right? If you say, I have $20 in my wallet and I do not have $20 in my wallet.
And that is what
that's a state of affairs that cannot maintain because it's self-defeating, right? Those sort of cancel each other out. We don't have a truth value.
And that's what they do in quantum physics. This is why Einstein had such an issue with quantum physics. He threw it out based on this very logical argument, because they would say that the quantum is there and not there at the same time in the same way. And that's illogical. Now, my argument would be it's not in the same there and not there in the same time, same way. It's that we don't have the technology yet to really understand what's going on at the quantum level.
Yeah, I'd say the same. I think we'd both probably agree that it doesn't, whatever you think of superposition and some of those quantum mechanics phenomena, I think it's more nuanced than that. It is both. It's more about a wave, right? It's a probability. It occupies a probability space, and that's a very interesting topic. But I think, at least if we're sort of trying to stay focused on logic, I don't think it undermines.
Yeah, so I get back to what's the source of it? Like what either created logic, or why is logic, these laws of logic, necessary? And from my point of view, I'm going to say they're necessary because God is logical, right? So it all comes from God.
Sorry to jump in.
Yep. For the record, he cut me off. I'm just saying.
That was a delay. It was just a delay. So if I asked you, why is God logical? I think that's actually the comparable question. One thing that happens, not to play too much commentary on the actual argument, but sometimes there's this view, or there's a sort of implicit framing in debates like this where we're talking about nature, and you're positing that nature needs a foundation, and I'm positing that nature doesn't need a foundation in some sense, and that we start speaking past each other, because it seems maybe, and this isn't to you specifically, but it seems sometimes from the other side that I'm just assigning arbitrary characteristics and qualities to nature, and you have an explanation, something that sort of actively establishes those things. But what we should actually be comparing, if we're comparing our worldviews, is whatever our metaphysical foundation is and how that thing gets its quality. So in my case, that is nature, but in your case, it's God. And so the comparison, to bring that home, is not how does nature become logical in my view and how does nature become logical in your view. It's how does your metaphysical foundation have a logical nature. I think we would both say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we would both say that it has that nature necessarily, that is, it doesn't have that because of an external explanation or source. You would say that for God, and I think I would say something similar for nature. If that little aside makes sense.
And I'm not sure that I'm personally going to fully have an answer for this question myself, but how would you define nature? What is nature in your understanding?
Yeah, sure. Maybe unsatisfactorily, I'd say it's everything that exists. It's
not just the physical world, but the immaterial as well.
Yeah, I think the sort of the naturalist distinction from theism is sort of just the claim at the bottom that I don't think there's a supernatural mind. So yeah, more or less reality, nature, these are sort of interchangeable. Sometimes I choose nature because it feels a little more intuitive for naturalism than saying something like reality that can kind of be coded with perception. So
in the way you laid out your argument for logic, would that then be a circular argument because you're kind of relying on nature to prove nature?
Well, no, in the same way. So, do you believe that God is logical necessarily?
Yes, this is where I would
Like, there's not a reason why. There's not something that makes God logical, right?
no, I'd put it this way. I'd reverse it and say logic exists because of God's attributes. God, I don't want to overuse the word nature. So because of his perfections or his attributes, his essence. So,
But that's a necessary causal chain in your view, that he exists that way eternally, innately, necessarily, without need or reference to external source explanation. So if I ask you, oh, well, what makes God that way? Surely he needs surely you have to ground something. You have to ground God's logicalness. You would say he's the bottom of the barrel, right? He's the ground floor. He's where the regress stops. Yeah. He's not the bottom of the barrel. Yeah, I didn't want to. Sorry.
Yeah, I would say, if I think about this, I think I'm not making a circular logical argument only because I'm not defining nature by nature. I'm not trying to prove, I'm not requiring nature to prove nature the way that I was seeing you were doing. I'm saying that the reason that there's logic in the world is because God created the world, and these are the rules he has, that because of who, right. I want to say who he is, but I don't want that to be confusing, but by his essence.
And what I'm saying is what I think the proper comparison is how do I explain the coherent existence, the logicalness of nature, and how do you explain the logical nature of God? Because those are our foundations.
Well, I would explain the logical nature of God. Ultimately, it's the being that he is. Now, can I fully comprehend it? I can't, because I can't fully comprehend God. All right.
And that's my answer basically for nature, is that it has an innate quality. It exists a certain way necessarily, and that's an immutable fact about it. And it's not any more or less circular for you to say that God holds a quality in the same way.
Well, no, because I'm not saying that that logic. I'm not trying to prove logic by logic's existence, right? I'm going to an external source, being that there's logic in the world because of the creator who created the world.
Right, but you're saying there's logic in your worldview because your metaphysical foundation has the necessary qualities innately and necessarily, sort of without external explanation.
And I'm just pausing to think through what you're saying, because I want to make sure I'm understanding it.
Yeah, sure.
And because I sense, just in my opinion, that we're talking past each other, and I don't want that.
Well, what if we did this? Maybe, and you can tell me if this helps. If we just take the specific label off, so we take God off of your label and we take nature off of mine, and we just say, I say, hey, my metaphysical foundation, which doesn't have a label, my anonymous metaphysical foundation is logical, and my explanation for that is that it has that attribute innately and necessarily. I think you would say, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but you would say, hey, your metaphysical foundation, which is now, for this thought experiment, anonymous, also has is also logical by the necessity of its own nature without external explanation. We would say I think we say the exact same things. And then I say, mine is natural, and you say, mine is spiritual, or mine is a God. But from a metaphysics standpoint, I think we're following the same criteria, which my hope would be, if it works for you, and I assume you believe it works for you, then if that criteria is being applied the same way, it should, whether or not I'm right, it should at least have parity with your explanation.
I'm going to use an example that may not be a good one. I'm just saying that right up front. But this is what I was trying to think earlier. So I have I have a daughter, right? Now, I'm not wanting to get into politics or arguments, but the idea of what is a woman, right? Is my daughter a woman because she identifies as a woman? Or is she a woman because she has the DNA from her mother and I that mixed and produced the genetics that give her the chromosomes for a woman, right? Now, I'm doing it this way to say, because this is how I'm seeing the argument. Someone who says, well, I'm a woman because I identify as a woman, can just as easily say I identify as a man. But that becomes an argument, a circular argument, right? Because you first have to, if you're trying to define what is a woman, and you're saying one that identifies as a woman, well, you haven't actually defined it, because you still don't know what a woman is that you identify as. Where in the one that I'm giving, my daughter is my daughter because of what was passed on to her, right? As parents, she only can have the genetic makeup that her mother and I share. And so because of who we are, we pass that on to her, and that makeup makes up who she is. So she's a woman, not because of how she identifies, but because an external source created her in that sense. And I know not created in the same way God created the universe. So I'm just before anyone yells at me for the way that I said create, but that's how I'm seeing the two. Does that make sense?
I think so. I just don't, maybe I'm not explaining it well, but I don't think, what I'm trying to get us to do is compare apples to apples. And I understand that in your view, nature is a contingent thing that in your view sort of begs of a source and an explanation, because it's not, in your view, it's not the necessary thing. But I think we both agree on a list of things being, something exists necessarily. It has a particular nature. It has particular, maybe I know that the word nature is going to get confusing. It has particular characteristics innately and necessarily, right? And those innate characteristics are expressed through the universe as we know it. You would put God at the top of your list. I would put nature at the top of my list. And I'm saying from a metaphysics standpoint, those are the same. I realize we're not explaining nature in the same way, but we are explaining, because what we're trying to do, I think, is compare foundations.
Yeah, that's important.
What we're not doing is comparing, or what I think we shouldn't be doing is comparing how each of us explain the universe first. What we're trying to explain is what's the foundation and how do you explain that thing. And I think for you, that's God. And for me, it's nature. And I think we have the exact same explanation.
Yeah, but I guess where I'm struggling is we're trying to answer what nature is, and you're saying it's because nature is. Right? So
we're saying, why is existence logical? You're saying because my metaphysical foundation is logical. And I'm saying, because my metaphysical foundation is logical, that's why existence in the universe is logical.
All right, let me well, I want to go to a series of questions, but actually what I should do is I should give a word to our sponsors. That's probably what I should do before we change topics, because they help sponsor the show so that we can continue doing things like this. The first and one of our longest running sponsors is MyPillow, which I encourage you to get their products, especially their pillows and their mattress topper. If you struggle with sleep, I have this little watch that tells me every morning how well I slept, which I enjoy and my bride does not. Why? Because my number is usually in the 90s and her number's usually in the 60s. And so there's people like me who can just put my head on the pillow and I'm usually out pretty quickly. But I don't sleep very long, where my bride has a hard time going to bed, or falling asleep, I should say, and then maybe staying asleep. She could sleep for a long time, unlike me. But one of the things that helped me actually get more sleep, when I started getting on MyPillow, it did help my sleep. That's why I ended up loving them, because I'm the type that I get up after about 3 hours. I just don't. I put my head back down on a pillow. I don't fall asleep. I started going back to sleep. The mattress topper is what made a big difference for me, though. When I got that 3-inch mattress topper, it really helped me to get comfortable and be able to get up in the middle of the night, go to the bathroom, come back, and go right back out, which again drives my wife nuts. But the MyPillows, I think their products are amazing, and the thing I'm learning as I've gotten older is the importance of sleep. When I was younger, everyone used to joke because I would say I can sleep when I'm dead. Well, the reality is the lack of sleep for so many years, well, that kind of encouraged the death thing. It has had a big impact on health as I've gotten older. So if you're younger, the importance of sleep, really important. And so what I suggest if you do struggle, consider checking out some of the products. Go to mypillow.com, use the promo code SFE. Not only does it get you the discounts with them, but it lets them know you heard about them here so they continue to sponsor us. One of the things I also do, as well, because I'm nuts, is I'm very into biohacking now, and I do my cold plunges every morning. Now, I have an expensive cold plunge. I got it from Plunge. And so you can go to strivingforeternity.org/plunge. They also have saunas. I have a sauna. I don't have a sauna from Plunge Company, but I have their cold plunge. But they have both saunas and plunges. Now theirs are good quality, especially their plunges are really good quality, and their saunas are good quality, but they're expensive. And so a lot of the people in my audience really wanted to get into cold plunging or doing the saunas. The advantages of heat therapy and cold therapy are different. I could do a whole show on what those advantages are. But I wanted to come up with a good solution that's a little bit more inexpensive for folks that can't afford that. And therefore, I worked out with Pod Company. Pod Company, and if you want, just go to strivingforeternity.org/pod. So same thing, strivingforeternity.org, and it's either going to be /plunge or /pod. But Pod Company has cold plunges. They have saunas. They're much more inexpensive, but still good, decent products. I have their sauna. It's a small sauna that is just a little bit. It's big enough that you could put a chair in there and you can sit in there, and that's about as big as one person. Has a nice clear door so that if you're like me, kind of hard to sit there for 30 minutes and do nothing. So I put a TV outside. I have a headset, a Bluetooth headset that I could, or speaker that I put inside because it can handle the heat, and I can sit there. It gets up to 180 degrees, the one that I have, and it does that within about 10, 15 minutes. So the advantage of that is it doesn't take long to get up to temperature, and then you can sit there. You really, if at 180 degrees, Actually, anything about 175 to 185, you want to be in there for 5 days a week for about 20 minutes. And so that's what I do to get the benefits of that. So if you want, go to strivingfortraining.org/either plunge or pod, so you get your choice of which ones to do. And those are some of the companies that sponsor us. Lastly is our Bible software. Very important to have good Bible software. Maybe if Landon had gotten this Logos Bible software when he was younger.
If only.
If that was the thing, if he had good Bible software, he would be on the show, teaching us apologetics.
I'd be hosting this thing.
Yeah, but I do. Logos is the software I use. I think it's great. It is easy to find things quickly, and now with some of the things they have with AI incorporated in, doing fuzzy searches, it becomes easy. Where you can say things like, you're trying to search where Jesus spoke of doves, and it can find that, give you all the Bible verses. So, logos.com/SFE. That's logos.com/SFE. That is how you can get a discount there. And keep in mind, Logos is known as being super expensive. It's a lot cheaper now because they've gone to more of a subscription base. So if you have not gone into that and don't have it, then that may be a way to go, is to do their subscription base. So with that, Landon, let me ask the question, because I don't know what your answer would be. I kind of have an inkling, but you mentioned the creation of the universe. Well, I'm going to ask the broad question first, but how do you think the universe came into existence?
Short answer, I have no idea. Slightly more nuanced answer. I think the natural world, so when I say something like nature or reality, I think that holds some possibility of sort of nature existing outside of our local universe, I guess is the clearer way to say that.
I want to make sure I understand what you just said, though. Nature, that nature exists outside of our local universe. So I want to make sure I understand how you're talking universe. Is that universe you see?
Yeah, the word universe
of nature?
I try to use the distinction of local universe. I think there's different ways people use universe. I think if we just mean everything that exists, that kind of universe, then I would say it's always existed. If we mean how is our particular space in the cosmos, like if we're talking about the Big Bang, where did all of the energy in the Big Bang come from? That I don't know. And I don't hold the assumption that when that expanded and created the universe as we know it, that is and always was the totality of everything that exists. So there's ways people will talk about a multiverse or Big Bang, Big Crunch. I mean, there's 100 models, ways that in theory are possible. So yeah, I'd say something like that.
Well, yeah, 100 models because you need a life-saving device, right? So if one fails, you got to create another. And I don't want to overlay my own thinking on yours, so I'm going to ask this question just as a clarifying question.
Sure.
Universe, the way I'm hearing it, it sounds like you're saying, okay, the universe, in your view of the natural world, there's a universe which is, it sounds like you're saying the physical world, and then there's a universe that's local universe, and then there's this nature that could include immaterial things. Would that be right or totally?
I say all of nature. I think immaterial things are a part of nature, so I don't necessarily think that has to be a.
But are those
specific
part of universe? Is I guess my question.
Are they what?
Part of the universe, like
yes.
I guess
all I'm saying is that I don't assume that the universe as we know it is all of nature. For example, what if there were two universes? that were. I'm not saying I think there are two universes. I'm just saying that's a logical possibility. There could be two universes, and ours, and they both came out of some common denominator natural state. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, we have very incomplete information and facts on that. I think but similar to the logic conversation, I would say the comparison is not from a cosmological standpoint. If we're talking about metaphysics and intelligibility and these other things, is to compare how I think nature is or can be eternal or timeless, and how you think God can be eternal and timeless, and whether or not we can both use that answer,
Okay. So the whether the Big Bang or whatever you would believe created the universe, the physical, because I think what I'm hearing is you believe that there's I'm just going to be simple, immaterial material. There's an immaterial that I think I'm hearing you say that always existed, but there's a physical that was created. Is that close?
Potentially. It gets a little complicated. I would say, I think a possible explanation would be that there is a state of matter that is timeless, and that spatio-temporal universes, like what we experience, arise out of that in some way. Or there could be a bigger physical universe. Inside of it are smaller physical universes like ours popping into existence. Like, I hold the view that if we're using our imagination, we could answer the view a million different ways. And, ultimately to settle it, we'll have to get some more information. But I think if we're talking about metaphysics and we're talking about intelligibility, I think it's more or less straightforward, I think, for me to posit a parity explanation that you might find from theism.
Yeah, because, where I was trying to go is to say we think of the universe. And if there's a fourth argument, I don't know. I can only think of three ways that the universe could have come into existence. Either it always existed, however, the problem there, Einstein's the second law of thermodynamics shows that energy has a lifespan, right? It had a beginning, it's going to have an end. And so the physical world, the energy we have had to have had a beginning, and it is winding down. And so I'm trying to use your language, the universe versus the nature, right? So we're talking the universe that this, the planets and things like this. So I would say that could not have always existed. But then if you say the other way would say that the universe created itself, but that would kind of destroy something go against what something we said earlier about the second law of logic, right? The universe would have to first exist to be able to create itself.
Sure. And I think one thing that I would acknowledge is that when we're talking about these kind of ultimate metaphysical origins, everyone's answer has to kind of take some swings. Like, I think theists might favor their own view out of familiarity, but your explanation, the theist explanation generally, is that God is a mind that somehow exists immaterially, which you could say, oh, well, how could nature exist timelessly or immaterially? It's like, we have no idea how a mind could do that either. And how can a timeless mind do things, right? If he's in a timeless state, how does he create temporal states? How can an immaterial mind create material reality, right? There's a lot of questions that we don't have any answer to. And so I only highlight that to say, even if your view is that God is a better explanation for the universe, the explanations for God, because we're stretching pretty far beyond our knowledge horizon, I think you would agree, even for the foundations of your own view, there's a lot of things that we can't totally grasp and certainly don't have a scientific understanding of. And so if we're just talking metaphysics, I think we can posit some plausible explanations. And then, I think if we're trying to make scientific arguments about thermodynamics, I think both of us would have a kind of hard time probably justifying things on that level.
The reason I was going this way is I think I'm trying to find common ground here, right? You and I would both appeal to something or someone creating the universe, right? There's the nature that we're both saying. You're saying nature, and I'm saying God pre-existed before the universe, right? So somehow that thing that we're saying is eternal creates everything else. Now, I think where the difference would be is, as a Christian, we're saying that it's God who has a mind versus nature that doesn't have a mind. It just is. And so it's, right, Occam's razor, the simplest argument. It's easier to accept that a mind that's thinking would create things versus nothing.
I would take Occam's razor the other way, but we may agree to disagree on that fact. Just because I would say that we both agree nature exists. I think that's from an Occam's razor standpoint, that's not controversial. I think saying if there was something, and I think we know of, regardless of how old you think the universe or the world is, we know that, I think we would both agree that nature existed before humans did, before the minds that we are now associating with creative powers. So as far as we know from a direct, scientific standpoint, stuff came first in at least our lineage. Whether you think God stepped in and then created minds, whatever, even in that story, nature was there. You would say, oh, well, God was the mind at the beginning, but like Earth is older than humanity. I think it's maybe a simple way to say it. And so positing an eternal nature, I think, is more parsimonious, meaning simpler from an Occam's razor standpoint. It makes fewer assumptions. It multiplies entities less, meaning it posits less things that need further explanation.
Maybe.
Like we've said, there's plenty of mysteries about it. I just don't think it's simpler to say there was an unlimited, all-powerful, immaterial mind floating in timeless space that had the ability and intention to create the universe as it is.
It's simpler to believe that nothing created everything, that there's no mind. But I would also argue...
It's not nothing. It's that nature in some state is necessary and has always existed.
But it doesn't create things, right? It doesn't have a mind, so it's not purpose.
But things could emerge in different ways. Snowflakes come out of thunderstorms.
Because God created it.
Well, because that's what physics does with frozen water and wind. I just say that to say there are constraints from physics that if you have energy in some form, things can. If you have quantum fields, things can, in theory, arise from that. But I think what I would just resist is that because I'm a naturalist, I need a scientific explanation for my view, and because you're a theist, you can keep a theological or metaphysical explanation. I think if we're going to talk metaphysics, I can offer a metaphysics explanation and say, I don't know the scientific answers, and you can posit a metaphysics answer and say that you don't know the science of how God created the universe, right?
Yes,
So it would be an inappropriate question, I think, for me to ask on that, if that makes sense.
I know the science that we have the scientific method that when we do experiments, you have to have someone who does the experiment and observes it and records it, and we have that in Genesis 1. Right? God was the only one that was there, and he wrote it down, right? Colossians 1, you had said earlier, what holds everything together? Well, Colossians 1 says that God does, right? He holds all things together, holds everything in place. And but I think where it comes down to really is we end up getting to a point of we're going to agree the universe exists. That's no brainer. This was the thing Darwin didn't do in his book, The Origin of Man, is describe the origin of man. He describes he's arguing that he's going to describe life, the origin of life, but he doesn't. He talks about everything after life. I guess the thing becomes the question of where does life itself come from, right? You and I have a self-consciousness. We don't see that in rocks or flowers or animals. I mean, you can see animals that will do what they're instinctively going to do, but you don't see them set up a council or a courtroom type scene and deliberate things like forgiveness or mercy, right? That's unique to the human kind.
Sure.
So where in your mind or your thinking, I mean, how did life come from non-life?
Now, to be clear, are you asking me a metaphysics question or a science question?
Well, if I ask it as a science question, you're going to say, I don't know. So
I'm going to say, do you know the science answer to that question? So we'll assume you're asking a metaphysics question, which I'll say.
I would argue, if you're going to ask me the science, I'm going to argue we wouldn't have the ability to know because it's something God did. I would argue that's what he did special with human beings because he created us where we have certain attributes that God has that animals don't, that we pass on to our lineage, to our different generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say the metaphysics answer, my sort of worldview answer broadly would be that life is an expression of the nature of reality. I think not to keep doing this like parody game, but I think, you believe, to borrow a phrase, we are created in the image of nature. You believe God has innate necessary features and that the way the world is, the way that we are consequences of that. And I think I would say something similar about nature, that coherence. And I think there's more to say about that, even using science. I'm not about dodging science. I just try to sort of be a stickler on comparing apples to apples and worldview stuff. But even, we've talked about quantum mechanics, and I think one thing we do see in quantum mechanics is some amount of seeming randomness, right? And what is even physical reality and time and space, and there's some of these categories seem to really break down. But as we come up that scale of nature, we get as coherence builds, right? The subatomic particles join together or break apart, and then they make atomic particles, and then they make molecules, and they make cells. As you move up, those levels of coherence constrain the randomness, they constrain the probability down, and things become stable. And I think ultimately that recursive coherence can build up until you get solar systems and ecosystems and ultimately humans, and you would say, oh, well, if it's all random at the bottom, how does a coherent picture emerge? And I would say, like, the table this computer is sitting on at its base layer, if we go down to quantum mechanics, is chaotic on some definition, right? It's hard to predict. There's seeming paradoxes, there's randomness, there's all these probabilities kind of bouncing up, but at the level of the table, it's very solid and stable. And so I think even if we rope in science, I think it supports at least a possible picture. And again, I'm not here to even argue that all of these explanations are better than your explanations. I think my assertion or my challenge against presuppositionalism would be there are not any more internal contradictions or impossibilities in my view than there are in theism. So it could be totally wrong, but it's not impossible, which I think is a low bar that naturalism can clear.
Well, except ultimately, I think you're going to disagree with this, so I'm just saying that up front, but
probably will.
Your argument really is a subjective one and not an objective one, because you're appealing to what makes the most sense to you rather than being able to say this is true, right? Because I think the issue is it becomes hard to say what's true because you need an objective, universal, absolute standard for that then.
You need an objective reference.
But how can you
I don't think that's the same thing as being a standard.
Well, but if it's just a reference, how can we get a reference without it being subjective? How do we
Well, it's not subjective, it's just fallible.
But well, that's even worse then. Because then we can't trust the reference.
The question is it impossible? Not is it worse?
Well, no, the question is what's true.
Well, sure, but your claim, if just to keep us in some presuppositional category, is that other explanations are not possible, that they're not logically coherent. So I think
they might. You can make so yeah. When we get into logic, you can have something that's coherent, right? You can have and still be a bad argument or an invalid argument.
Which is fine. And if that's the view you take, I much prefer it. If you say, hey, your view is possible, I just don't think it's true. Many of the tag proponents or presuppositional people I've talked to would consider that a huge win on my side because they hold a very firm line that accounting for these things is logically impossible, actually impossible for other views outside of the Christian worldview.
Yeah, and
that's the reason I harp on that. And if that's not your view, then I won't hold you to it.
Yeah, no, I'll recommend if folks want, if they go to the Striving Fraternity YouTube channel, we have an 8-week class on, I'm trying to remember what the title of it is. It sounded like apologetics and debate, I think is what it was, but it was a class I taught for another group. And basically I taught the first 4 classes are on hermeneutics, the second 4 are on logic. And when I go through logic, we talk about the difference of you can have an argument that can be logically sound and yet still invalid. So it's still illogical. It's still not a good argument. So logic itself, there's 2 components to it, is the point, right? You have soundness and coherence, but then within that, and coherence is where, soundness is where you have a definitive, right? This piece of paper is white or black, and if those are the only 2 colors in the world, you could say that, but if could be blue, right? That's an absolute because there's a finite number of possibilities. So but coherence would be something where you're now working maybe off of percentages. And so when you're looking at coherence, most Americans carry U.S. dollars. Well, yeah, that's probably true, right? Percentage-wise. But it's not going to be true for everyone, right? But if I say every American carries only U.S. dollars, now I go into a different. Now I'm into soundness. So there's two components to logical arguments, and so I can concede that you can construct an argument that is logically coherent, but still not sound.
Well, I'm happy to hear you say that, because I've been told many times I cannot do that. So at least on this show, I have cleared that bar. Well, or at least canon principle.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing being is, I would say, like in this, you can construct something where logically it fits the definitions for logic, for that, but it's not sound because the standard is depending on, like, what I'm seeing is like your argument for nature is depending on nature. So it becomes circular. That then becomes a problem, right? So my whole thing is going to be, you need the basis. You need a standard for logic to be true, right? I would argue you don't have that. You would argue you do, right?
I would argue I have it in the same way you have it, which is a more specific claim. But I think one thing falls to this dichotomy. Just if I could speak back to your point about that being subjective, there seems to be this dichotomy often put forward that it's either a quote unquote absolute authority. From my view on the outside, I think sometimes theists have a bit of an obsession with this idea of like ultimate authority and absolute standards, because that's how their worldview works from the top down in that sense. The dichotomy is not, it's either an ultimate absolute quote unquote authority, active authority, something imposing or sustaining or grounding whatever thing it is we're talking about, or it's quote unquote subjective, or it's like totally up to me, I just make it up, it's just about my opinions. Those are definitely not the only two possibilities. I think there are plenty of things in my worldview. There are states of affairs. There are things that are true that are not up to me. I'm not you can see in the comments a lot of those, like, by whose standard? By what's whatever. Those are not gotcha questions. Like, even in something like ethics, like I believe there are things like objective moral judgments that are not just about, it doesn't appeal to an ultimate authority like a god, but it isn't up to an individual's, current momentary preferences or opinions. And so I only say that to say I think there is some third way in some of these topics that tends to be a bit more nuanced, but doesn't have to sort of fall on this, like, I think I'm God or you think God is God kind of thing.
Well, and I'm going to try and in the last 10 minutes, because I wanted to give the last 15 minutes to this, but last 10 minutes are going to change gears. But I'll just say this is the reason I think we appeal to an absolute truth and universal truth is because if we're saying it's true, it has to be for everyone everywhere and never change. And that's why it has to be, what's the ultimate truth? What's the ultimate authority for truth becomes the question. But I want to appeal to your conscience, right? Because we can talk in the philosophical realm, and what can happen is we could just go round and round as I think you've done with many people, because you got a lot of pastors in your life.
I'm getting it from all sides.
Yeah. And maybe I'll come down your way and you'll have another pastor in your life, Sure. But, let me just put it in this way. Do you think that whether you believe in heaven or hell or not, do you think that you'd be a good enough person to go to heaven?
Oh, I have no idea. Depends how you define the criteria.
Okay, so let me define it. Have you ever told a lie?
We had this conversation last time. I think I called in.
Probably.
If your question is, have I ever done anything wrong, therefore I will not get into heaven, then the answer is no, I would not get into heaven by that criteria.
Okay, because you and I would be guilty of breaking God's law, right?
Sure.
So,
in that scenario, yes.
yeah. And so the thing is, so Romans 1 talks about the fact that people, they know God exists because he's given them ample evidence, but what they do is they suppress that truth in unrighteousness. And my concern for you, Landon, I mean, great conversation we've had, and I enjoyed it. I learned some things. I hope you did too. We could sit over a cup of coffee and probably talk for another 6 hours, right? And we can enjoy it. My greatest concern for you, though, and I think you understand where I'm coming from when I say this, my greatest concern is where you spend eternity. Because we could try to find common ground in our philosophical arguments. We could try to debate our different views philosophically, things like this. But, I mean, how much would I have to hate you to believe that because you and I are guilty of breaking God's law, knowing you would spend eternity in a lake of fire and not want to plead with you to repent, right? And so the reason I go to the Ten Commandments to define really what it means to be a criminal in God's sight is because it helps us to understand that you and I, if we look at the Ten Commandments, I'll speak for myself, but you could decide if you've broken any of the commandments, right? I would be a lying, thieving, murderer at heart, covetous, adulterer in heart, who doesn't honor father and mother. I mean, you go through a whole 10 commandments, I've broken them all, right? Because the murder and adultery isn't just what we do, but what we think, which kind of makes it worse. Because we act a lot better than what goes on in our minds usually, or always, because there's times we think things and we don't carry it out. And so what I want to appeal to is the fact that if you're one of the 180,000 people that are going to die today and you faced God and you know that by his standard you would be guilty, and you know that according to the Bible, that guilt would carry an eternal consequence of the lake of fire as an eternal punishment because you knew who God was, but you suppressed that. Do you have a concern for that? Do you have a concern that you could face God as judge?
Not really, no.
Why not?
There's a lot of reasons. I guess the simple one would be I just genuinely do not think there's a good reason to think that's the case. If it were the case, hypothetically, I think I would argue it's like sort of a tough, it's hard in my mind to call the God who oversees that system good, because again, I can only speak for myself. I understand the Bible says whatever the Bible says about certain things, and you can choose to take those as absolute, quote unquote, absolute truths. But for me, all I know is like I explore ideas in good faith. I have good reasons to be a good person. I don't feel like I'm lacking motivation or things in life that I need to get from this God that I just genuinely don't feel convinced is real in the sense that you're describing. And so if it turns out that I'm just genuinely mistaken about that, I don't know how to hypothetically say what I should be concerned about. All I can say is, as far as I know, I'm just genuinely unconvinced that that is the case. And it's not it's not because I think I'm an amazing, perfect person. It's none of that. Like, I know in your view it might be a pride thing on some level, or some suppressed knowledge thing or something. I get that, like, groups have those dogmas, but yeah, all I can say is I'm not worried about it, because I just actually genuinely, I don't feel resistant to it, and I just don't think it's true. And if it was, I don't know what I would be able to do about that. Well, so it doesn't seem I can choose to be convinced that that's the case.
It is true, but what you do about it is you have to repent, which is the idea of turning in your thinking. Stop trusting yourself, whether you're good works or thinking you're not saying you think you're a good person, but in your case you're thinking you don't need a savior, right? Because you don't think there is a savior, and so. Because ultimately, God gave us a conscience so we know the difference between right and wrong, so that we would know that we are accountable to Him. Because there wouldn't be, if your worldview is right, there wouldn't be a wrong. There wouldn't be a difference of good and evil, because things just are.
No, I have a comprehensive account of ethics that includes objective moral judgments, personally, and I think a lot of quote-unquote atheists do. That's sort of back to that. I don't think the actual dichotomy is ultimate authority or everything goes kind of thing. That's it. I'm just speaking for myself. That's not my view. My view does account for those things.
Yeah, but again, if there's not a objective absolute standard, then it would just be subjective.
Well, there are standards, but there's not an absolute authority in the way that I think the theist implies. Yeah.
And so, my greatest concern for you, Landon, is really comes down to where you spend eternity. Like I said, we could sit and go back and forth, but and I know that last time you were on, and his name just escaped me.
George.
I wanted to say Ben, and I knew that was wrong. George was appealing to you to, as he would kind of say, like, try Jesus. And I would say you did do that, but you didn't really, right?
Says you.
And I wonder how much that's tainting kind of your thinking. Is that, I wonder if you kind of, and I don't know because I don't know your heart, but, and I'm not asking for an answer on this, but I wonder how much you just feel that you tried Jesus, that you believe, you honestly think that you believed and you were a Christian when you were younger, and therefore you're saying, I had that experience and it didn't work. And therefore you're looking for other answers to life, the universe, and everything, if anyone gets that reference. If you don't get that reference, then, go hitchhike to the end of the galaxy. Oh, wait, you didn't get that reference either. Go look up Douglas Adams and you'll see his books. Right, but ultimately that becomes the thing. I wonder if you're, because you think you were once a Christian, that you are trying to find some other answers. And what I would challenge you is to really read through the scriptures and instead of trying to disprove it, but look through the scriptures to see that it's true, and so that you can have eternal life. That would be my greatest concern. I'm going to ask the audience for folks to be praying for Landon, because obviously we would believe that you need Christ. So,
yeah, I appreciate that. I know that comes from a good place, and I appreciate that sentiment. Yeah, I was just going to say, I assume we're closing here. If anyone, I know there's been a lot of comments going. I'm more than happy. I just want to say to anyone in the comments, I'm more than happy to have these conversations. If I've said things that you think are absolutely insane and you would like to say that to me directly or ask me a question or whatever, YouTube is probably the best place. Just in the comments on this video on YouTube, I'm happy to chat with people. I know there's like questions here about morals and objective standards and this and that. If anyone's actually interested, I would love to have conversations. So feel free to just drop a comment, or I'll drop a comment under the video and people can say hi. I'm an open invitation.
well, there you go. So hopefully some folks will take you up on that. And, you know, if I'm coming through your way, we'll grab a cup of coffee and talk for 6 hours or so.
Please do. It's a wonderful place.
Yeah. So let me just say I do want to put up one comment from way earlier because it's going to come into play here. Wesley says, this is when we talked about if you were the guy that was talking with James White. He said, I've only ever watched formal debate from people like James White and a few other apologists. I can't tell the presidential stuff 100%, not a debate. It's a shouting match. Well, Wesley, I believe that there is another person you've watched other than James White do a debate, and that would be on this channel twice, and that person would be your father. Just saying. But I bring that up for this reason. Next week there will be no show because it is my anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you. My 25-year-old bride and I will be celebrating our 32nd wedding anniversary. If you guys have a problem with that math, you're either not married or very dumb.
You must not know the ultimate standard.
That's right. In this case,
the
wife is not 25, okay? However, so no show next week because I'm going to take my bride out for our anniversary. But on the 21st of May, Wesley has a debate. Now, it was one that was planned before, but his opponent had to change. Wesley and his fellow debater, they are both high school students. But Wesley, the debate is going to be on capital punishment. And so basically these are two young men that are looking to hone their skills as debaters. And so they picked a topic and wanted to do a formal debate. And that's one of the things we do here on the show. And so on the 21st, I encourage you guys to come in, maybe invite some friends, because what'll be helpful is to go through and be able to get some questions from you in the audience for them. Because, yes, these guys are friends, and I don't know if they're going to talk through their arguments ahead of time or not and maybe well-versed on their arguments. And so it's sometimes always good to get an argument you didn't expect. Now, I hope that Landon will come back and watch on the 28th. I'm going to tell you why, Landon, because this was a surprise to me this past, well, I guess it was last week. For folks who remember, I was in Dallas and I did a debate with an atheist, Bill Cluck. And Bill is a professing atheist who does a book club with a Christian friend of his, and it's the Atheist Christian Book Club. He leads it as the atheist, and Bill and his friend James is the Christian. And if you go back on these shows, you see that I had both of them on at one point. And, you may have remembered that toward the end, Bill got up and walked out. And, his girlfriend said that was very unusual for him, although he did say he was doing it for dramatics. However, Bill informed me that he's a theist. He has converted. He did it about 10 months ago, and he did it on Eric Hoven's program. Eric had him on. Eric has had him on before, and he announced that he was a theist, which becomes an interesting thing for his Atheist Christian Book Club because they need a different atheist now. But he's going to come on and explain the arguments that convinced him, someone who grew up kind of like Landon here. He grew up in a Christian home, walked away from the faith. He is not a Christian yet. I was joking with him about that. But he is a theist. And so he wanted to come on and explain those arguments that he has. So that will be on the 28th. Now, just to give you guys a heads up, looking down the future, June, there will be no show on the 4th. Because, well, Wesley's dad is on my board of directors, and he's going to be in town, and we have some plans to go out for dinner and have a meeting, and it's the only day he's going to be able to come this way. So, therefore, there will be no show on the 4th. So that's what we got coming forward. I didn't get to talk much about the Truth Fellowship conference we had, but it was a great conference. You may, if you listen to my Rappaport podcast, you will hear some of the people that spoke at that conference, as they're going to be, I'm having a couple of them on talk about some of their topics. If you have an idea of some of the topics, one of the ones that really I thought was really good was Russell Fuller's topic on anti-Semitism, both outside and inside the church. There was, I might have John Harris on, where he talked about basically the state, his view of the state of the church. But I do have scheduled to have on Pastor Jeff Clower, he's been on before, but he basically gave a really good charge for why we as Christians, it's time to metaphorically stand up and fight. It's time for us to not just constantly be the punching bag of the world, which is typically what Christians end up doing. So I hope this has been helpful to you guys. Be praying for Landon that he would come to know Christ. I don't mean that in any negative way. It's a sincere plea for you, because that's my greatest concern for you.
I receive it as such.
Well, thank you. And you're always welcome on anytime. And folks, take him up on the offer to talk to him in the chat, in the comments of this video on YouTube.
Yeah, would love it.
So, and with that, folks, that's a wrap. Nope, wait, that's how I end my rap report. I end this one by saying, remember to strive to make today an eternal day for the glory of God, and we'll see you next time.